It's a good question. You hear about these things, wars, presidents, special planes. And sometimes the stories get mixed up, or people just wonder how dangerous it really was back then. So, let's talk about that first Air Force One and if Japanese fighters ever tried to shoot it down. Well, the simple answer right off the bat is no, that didn't happen. But to really get why it didn't happen, we need to look at a few things. We need to think about what Air Force One means, when it started, and when Japanese fighters were actually a threat. The timeline really matters here. We can start by thinking about a president flying at all. For a long time, presidents didn't fly in planes. They used trains mostly. It was safer, more reliable, and planes were still pretty new and sometimes dangerous. But then World War II happened. And when you have a world war, the president needs to travel. He needs to meet other leaders, he needs to go to conferences in different countries, and those conferences were far away. Taking a ship took too long. It was too slow during a fast-moving global conflict. So, flying became necessary. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was the first U.S. president to fly while in office. His first flight was in 1943. He went to the Casablanca Conference in North Africa. He flew in a Boeing 314 Clipper, a big flying boat. It was a commercial plane, actually. Then, for the Tehran Conference, he flew on a C-54 Skymaster. This was a military transport plane. It was called the Sacred Cow. This plane was the first one really set aside for presidential use. But it wasn't called Air Force One then. The plane was just Air Force serial number 42 to 107,451. And it had special things inside, like an elevator for Roosevelt's wheelchair. Now, flying during the war was risky. Very risky. These planes were flying over oceans, sometimes near war zones. There was always a chance of mechanical trouble, bad weather, or even enemy action. German U-boats were a threat in the Atlantic. Japanese submarines were a threat in the Pacific. And, of course, enemy planes were a danger too, but the flights Roosevelt made were carefully planned. They flew routes that tried to avoid enemy areas as much as possible, and they had military escorts when they could. Still, the danger was real. Everyone knew it. So, it makes sense why someone might wonder if one of these early presidential planes got attacked. The war was happening all around. Japanese fighters were very good and very aggressive early in the war. The image of a president's plane flying through danger, maybe even getting attacked, fits a dramatic idea of wartime. But we need to remember the details. We need to remember when the Sacred Cow was flying, and who was flying in it, and where they were going. Roosevelt flew in that plane for trips like Yalta. That was in February 1945. The war in Europe was still going on, but the war in the Pacific was getting closer to its end. Because Japan was already on the defensive. After Roosevelt died in April 1945, Harry S. Truman became president. He used the Sacred Cow too. His most famous trip on that plane was to the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. That was in Germany after the defeat of Germany. The war against Japan was still happening then. The atomic bombs were dropped in August 1945. Japan surrendered shortly after that. So, by the time Truman was regularly using these special presidential planes, the war against Japan was either winding down or completely over. This timing is a really important piece of the puzzle. It helps us understand why the question of Japanese fighter attacks doesn't quite fit the facts. These planes started being used for presidents when the biggest threats from enemy fighters were already fading or gone. When people talk about the first Air Force One, they are often thinking about a specific plane. Not just any plane a president flew in. They usually mean the VC-118, a Douglas Liftmaster that President Harry S. Truman used. This plane was named the Independence. It was delivered to the Air Force for presidential use in 1947. Think about that year, 1947. The war was over. World War II ended in 1945. Japan had surrendered in August of that year. Its military, its air force had been completely dismantled. So, when the Independence became the main plane for the president, there were no Japanese fighters left to attack it. There were no Japanese fighters, period. Not in any real fighting capacity anyway. The Independence was a really special plane for its time. It was a 4-engine propeller plane, much more advanced and comfortable than the Sacred Cow. Truman himself picked out the interior design. It had a stateroom, a main cabin, and a place for staff to work. It was designed specifically for the president's use. It was meant to be a flying office and home away from home. Truman loved flying in it. He used it a lot. He flew all over the United States and to other countries. He used it for important meetings and for campaigning. Now, about the name Air Force One. This is where a lot of the confusion comes from. The term Air Force One wasn't actually used until 1953. It wasn't a name for a specific plane. It's a call sign. What's a call sign? It's like a special radio code. The Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, came up with it. They did this after an incident where an Eastern Airlines commercial flight had the same flight number as President Dwight D. Eisenhower's plane, which was then Air Force 8610. Both planes were flying in the same airspace. It was a mix-up. Air traffic control could have confused them. So, to prevent any future confusion, they made a rule. Anytime the President of the United States is on board an Air Force aircraft, that aircraft's call sign becomes Air Force One. It doesn't matter what kind of plane it is, it's about who is on board. So, the Independence, Truman's plane, was never actually called Air Force One during Truman's presidency. It was just Air Force serial number 46 to 505. But because it was the first plane really designed and used for the president on a regular basis after World War II, many people retroactively think of it as the first Air Force One. And that's okay, people understand what you mean, but the point about the call sign is important for the timeline. The call sign Air Force One came into being in 1953. By 1953, the war with Japan had been over for 8 years. There was no military threat from Japan. So if we are talking about the Independence as the first Air Force One, then the question of Japanese fighter attacks makes even less sense. That plane wasn't even built until after the war, and if we're talking about the formal call sign Air Force One, that didn't exist until almost a decade after the war ended. The planes that flew presidents during the actual war, like the Sacred Cow, were military transports. They faced general wartime risks, yes, but the specific image of Air Force One fighting off Japanese Zeros just doesn't line up with history. The presidential fleet, in the way we think of it today, came into its own in a post-war world. A world where Japan was no longer an enemy. To understand why a Japanese fighter attack on a presidential plane, especially what we might call the first Air Force One, couldn't have happened, we need to really look at what happened at the end of World War II. And Japan was fighting a desperate war by 1945. Its navy was largely destroyed. Its air force, while still having some planes and pilots, was severely depleted. Most of their best pilots were gone. Their planes were older and not as well maintained. They were running out of fuel, parts, and experienced people. They were mostly focused on defending the home islands from the massive American bombing campaigns. By the summer of 1945, the Allied forces, mainly the United States, had complete air superiority over the Pacific. American planes like the B-29 bombers were flying over Japan almost unopposed. The Japanese planes that did try to intercept were usually shot down. Japan's military had been pushed back to its home territory. They were no longer in a position to project power far beyond their borders. They weren't flying planes over the open ocean looking for targets. They were fighting for survival on a much smaller scale. Then came August 1945. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These were devastating. Japan surrendered shortly after, on August 15, 1945. The formal surrender ceremony happened on September 2nd, 1945, on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. With the surrender, Japan's military was completely disarmed. They were occupied by Allied forces, mostly American troops under General Douglas MacArthur. Their armed forces, including their air force, were disbanded. Fighters, bombers, naval ships all were either destroyed or taken by the Allies. And Japan was not allowed to have an offensive military after the war. So, after September 1945, there was no Japanese air force capable of fighting. There were no Japanese fighters to attack anything, let alone a special plane carrying the U.S. president. When President Truman's independence was delivered in 1947, Japan was a peaceful, occupied nation. Its military had ceased to exist. Any flights the president took, whether in the United States or overseas, were not under threat from Japanese forces. The war was over. The enemy was gone. This also means that any presidential plane that flew during the actual war years, like the Sacred Cow used by Roosevelt and early Truman, was operating in a different context. Those planes flew mostly in the European theater or across the Atlantic. While there was a general threat from German U-boats or possible German aircraft, those were separate from the Japanese threat. And when they flew into the Pacific theater, it was later in the war when American forces largely controlled the skies. A Japanese fighter attack on a U.S. presidential plane just wasn't a plausible scenario, even during the war. The routes were chosen to be safe. The timing was crucial. It's easy to conflate different parts of history. We hear about the danger of wartime flying and the special status of a president's plane. And it's natural to combine those ideas, but the reality is that the threat from Japan ended with its surrender. And the specific planes, often thought of as the first Air Force One, came onto the scene after that surrender. The historical facts are clear. There was no window of time when a U.S. presidential plane, especially the Independence or any plane called Air Force One, could have been attacked by Japanese fighters. The war was over and Japan's air power was gone before such a scenario could ever happen. The threat simply wasn't there anymore. After World War II ended in 1945, President Truman continued to travel a lot. He needed a reliable way to get around the country and to meet with other world leaders. The Independence, the VC 118, was really important for this. It was a new era. The world was changing, and air travel was becoming the main way for heads of state to move around. Truman used the Independence for both domestic and international trips. He flew to South America, and he flew to Europe. He used it during his 1948 re-election campaign, famously flying all over the country and making whistle-stop speeches. This plane made presidential travel much faster and more efficient. He could cover huge distances in hours instead of days. This changed how presidents could do their jobs. It let them be more connected to the country and the world. During all these flights, there were no threats from enemy fighters, not from Japanese fighters as we've already covered. From any other nation either. The Cold War was starting, yes, but it was a very different kind of conflict. There weren't enemy fighters actively trying to shoot down a U.S. president's plane in the late 1940s or early 1950s. The world was still recovering from the global war. Security for presidential air travel did evolve, though. It became more organized, more professional. This wasn't because of an active threat from enemy nations trying to shoot down the plane. It was more about general safety, efficiency, and the increasing importance of the president's movements. The Secret Service was always involved, of course, and the Air Force was responsible for operating the planes and ensuring their safety. They planned routes carefully, checked the weather, and made sure the aircraft were well maintained. The most significant step in formalizing presidential air travel security and the creation of the Air Force One call sign came in 1953. This was during President Dwight D. Eisenhower's time. As mentioned before, his plane Air Force 8610 was in the same airspace as a commercial flight, Eastern 8610. Air traffic controllers were worried about mixing up the two flights. So the Air Force and the FAA decided to create the unique call sign Air Force One for any aircraft carrying the president. This was a safety measure. It was about preventing accidental errors, not about defending against an attack. After the Independence, Eisenhower got his own presidential planes. He mostly used two Lockheed Constellations, the VC-121A Columbine II and the VC-121E Columbine III. These were even larger and more comfortable planes. They were officially the first planes to use the Air Force One call sign. So, if you want to be really strict about it, the first Air Force One wasn't even Truman's plane, it was Eisenhower's. And by Eisenhower's time, it was almost a decade after the war. The idea of Japanese fighters attacking anything was completely obsolete. The history of presidential air travel is a story of increasing sophistication and security. From Roosevelt's wartime trips on borrowed military transports to Truman's custom-built Independence, and then to Eisenhower's planes using the famous call sign, it was a constant process of making presidential travel safer and more effective. But this evolution happened in a post-war world. It happened without the threat of Japanese fighters because that threat had already been eliminated with the end of World War II. The focus shifted from combat threats to operational safety, reliability, and the need for a president to work and travel efficiently in a busy modern world. So, we've gone through a lot of ground here. We started with the question, was the first Air Force One attacked by Japanese fighters? And the answer, very clearly, is no. It just didn't happen. But let's recap why, so it all makes sense. First, the term Air Force One itself didn't exist during World War II. It was created in 1953, years after the war ended. It's a radio call sign, not the name of a specific plane. So no plane flying during the war could have been called Air Force One. Second, the planes people often think of as the first Air Force One, like President Truman's VC-118, the Independence, were delivered and put into presidential service after World War II. The Independence started flying presidents in 1947. Japan surrendered in August 1945. So, by the time Truman was using the Independence, Japan's military, including its Air Force, had been completely dismantled. There were no Japanese fighters to pose a threat. Third, even the planes that presidents did fly in during World War II, like President Roosevelt's C-54 Skymaster, the Sacred Cow, did not face attacks from Japanese fighters. These planes were military transports, they flew carefully planned routes, they mostly operated in the European theater or across the Atlantic, far from Japanese air power. When they were in areas closer to the Pacific War, it was later in the war when the Allies had air superiority and Japan's air force was on its last legs. The specific scenario of Japanese fighters intercepting and attacking a US presidential plane during the war just wasn't a historical reality. It's easy to get confused about historical timelines. Movies and stories can sometimes blur the lines between different events or eras. The image of a president flying through a war zone is dramatic, and it was certainly dangerous for Roosevelt to fly during the war. But the specific threat of Japanese fighters attacking a plane that was or would become known as Air Force One simply doesn't align with the facts. The planes that fulfilled that role came into service when Japan was no longer an enemy. Understanding history requires looking at the specific details and the sequence of events. We need to know when things happen. We need to know what capabilities each side had at certain times. When we put all these pieces together, the creation of the Air Force One call sign, the delivery dates of presidential planes, and the end of Japan's military power, it becomes clear that the attack you asked about could not have happened. The story of presidential air travel is still fascinating. It's about how leaders adapt to new technologies, how security evolves, and how important travel becomes in a globalized world. But it's also a story that needs to be told accurately, and in this case, the truth is that the first Air Force One was safe from Japanese fighters because the war had already ended.